Good morning in the United States, good afternoon in Europe. I'm Ben Haddad, I'm the director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today for this conversation on relaunching the transatlantic trade agenda. We're going to talk today about an issue brief we recently published by Emily Bell on relaunching the transatlantic trade agenda from a European perspective, and Emily will come here to introduce this paper in a couple minutes. And this will be followed by a great conversation moderated by our Borden Gray Senior Fellow and the Deputy Director of our Geoeconomics Center, Julia Friedlander, with Susan Danger, the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in the EU, Congressman Don Bayer, and a member of the European Parliament, Arnaud Danjean. I want to say I'm really pleased to have this conversation today. You know that we at the Atlantic Council are committed to promoting relations with ally, American engagement abroad, free trade, and of course, at the heart of this, the transatlantic relationship. And we've seen the turmoil in transatlantic trade in the last few years. But one of the reasons why I think Emily Bell did such a fantastic job in this paper, and I'm glad that we're hosting this conversation, is because it still starts with a very lucid and realistic perspective about where we are and the backlash against globalization and trade that we've seen in our policies in the last few years, both in the United States and in Europe. And I think starts with some very concrete policy prescriptions to relaunch an agenda, taking into consideration some of that backlash in public opinion, taking into consideration also the need to have a conversation about a supply chain with respect to China, especially in the post-COVID arena. So we're hoping to have a conversation that comes up with concrete prescriptions, but at the same time, I think take stock of where we are and where we've been in the last few years. So with that, I'll turn it to Emily to introduce the paper for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation with our guests.
So many thanks, Ben, for your kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Bell, the author of the issue brief. It's a great time to be writing about the transatlantic trade agenda, and I was delighted to write this issue brief and conduct interviews with European sources. I'm going to highlight in a few words the key findings of the issue brief. It will be very short since a very exciting panel with high-level speakers is waiting to discuss the topic. I would like to underline first that I wrote this issue brief with a European perspective. The goal was to inform the discussion in Washington by providing a European point of view. The following roundtable will be a great opportunity to also hear about American perspectives. So what are the main highlights of this issue brief? There are 3 of them that I'm going to outline. First highlight, the election of Joe Biden has created a window of opportunities that must be grasped. EU-US two-way trade in goods and services is worth around $1 trillion annually. This relationship is key for the prosperity of both sides of the Atlantic, and obviously for the post-COVID recovery. The European Union has always considered the United States a privileged partner with shared values. Yet, Europeans have suffered from the unpredictability and transactional approach of the Trump administration. The election of Joe Biden has generated a lot of hope and goodwill in Europe. European institutions rapidly extended a hand, notably by publishing in December 2020 an ambitious proposal for a new EU-US partnership. Despite tensions around the signature of the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the new administration's discourse has also been very positive and encouraging. So the will to build something positive is today shared on both sides of the Atlantic. EU-US agreement in March to suspend all tariffs imposed in the context of the Airbus-Boeing dispute for an initial period of 4 months is an excellent sign. Yet, the momentum and goodwill created by Biden's election will not be sustained forever. Now is the time to start building a concrete trade agenda. Second highlight, the global balance has changed since 2016. So beyond a trade agreement, we need a real partnership. Indeed, the clocks will not wind back to 2016 and we will not return to TTIP. Trade policy is not just about trade agreements and tariffs, but also reflects technological, security, and geopolitical challenges. Transatlantic trade is today more about services, and notably digital services, than goods. So beyond the trade agreement, this issue brief advocates for a true geopolitical and economic partnership to address systemic issues, from climate change, digital taxation, to China's practices. Lessons have to be learned from the failure of the TTIP negotiation. Based on interviews with European sources, this paper recommends adopting a step-by-step approach that pays greater attention from the start to the concern of public opinion, and notably on climate change, to the diversity of European sensitivities, and to the need to rebuild trust progressively. Last but not least, third highlight, relaunching the transatlantic trade agenda can follow 3 ways that are developed in greater detail in the issue brief. So very briefly, first, lifting Trump's tariffs durably and starting by re-engaging on conformity assessment negotiations. Second, building a partnership on issues of shared geopolitical ambition, notably China's disruption of trade rules, foreign investment screening and export control, digital trade and technologies, climate change, and supply chain security. Third, reforming together the World Trade Organization by updating the rule book to better reflect current global economic challenges, resolving the WTO dispute settlement system standoff, and reinforcing the WTO monitoring role. This is just a rapid overview. I invite you to read the issue brief if you want to learn more, of course. So now I can't wait to hear from our speakers, to see what they think about the situation, and to compare their perspectives from both Brussels and Washington. So many thanks, and now I give the floor to Julia.
Thank you, Emily, for that wonderful overview. And please also, if you haven't yet, to our audience, please check out the paper. It is a wonderful overview of the issues at hand. It's my pleasure today to moderate this distinguished panel on an issue that is very, very close to my own heart. And I think, as Emily noted, a lot of the transatlantic frictions that we've had in the past aren't actually the determinant ones for the future. So I think that this, as we move into hopefully post-COVID recovery, fiscal recovery, recovery in the commercial sector, we use this moment to take a critical look at how we can move forward. So without further ado, perhaps since we just heard a little bit of the European perspective, I might turn to the U.S. Congress first. It's a pleasure today to welcome Representative Beyer to the panel. I might just ask you for an initial response to the paper. How do you see this from the congressional perspective with your own leadership and also having served as a U.S. ambassador in Europe?
Yeah, and having been born in Europe, in Trieste. I was just thinking
I just learned, yes.
Yeah, my grandmother Clara's parents came from Denmark. My grandfather Otto's parents came from Tallinn. And I've occasionally been the largest volley dealer in America, off and on. So we're very, very tied to Europe. I'm very optimistic right now. I think it's driven by at least 3 big things. Number one, the centrality of China in terms of the trade concerns for the U.S. and for Europe. There's from the President Biden's recent paper on trade, he goes through everything from government sanctioned forced labor, overcapacity in numerous sectors, coercive technology transfer, et cetera, et cetera. We always, I think, see our ability to try to bring China into a rules-based trade thing if we do it in partnership with Europe. We're not going to be able to do it by ourselves. Part 2 is data has changed all of our lives. So we live in this incredible information revolution. And once again, it creates so much good, but also so many challenges. And finding ways to help the big guys, the Googles and the like, the Facebooks, to be responsible partners in helping to grow our cultures, our societies, and do it together and do it in a way that recognizes the enormous revenues that are coming from that and the data privacy concerns that come out of it. Again, we have to do together. And then finally, we're each other's largest markets. And one of the things I've been impressed by as a businessman and as a former diplomat is how often the lack of homogenization of rules and testing is an inefficiency that affects us all. That while we don't need to maybe tear down a lot of trade barriers between the US and Europe, we do need to find ways to make, for example, avoid the enormous cost of going through the homologation of every new vehicle that comes from Europe in the US when they've already been determined to be safe there. And so there's a lot of excitement. One big shift is that in the Trump administration, Ambassador Lighthizer was excited and committed to bilateral trade agreements rather than multilateral. I think of President Biden's recommitment to the world, WTO, WHO, EU, NATO, et cetera, I think the plausibility of meaningful bilateral trade agreements becomes much better. I've been a huge TTIP fan for a long time, and maybe we don't go right to TTIP, but we can find select areas that move us in that direction.
Thank you so much for that. And I agree. And again, in the paper, Emily highlights how we cannot go back to 2016 necessarily, but find a way to sort of chip away at the edges. And of course, I think conformity assessments, as you mentioned, being one of the central areas for us to work on. Susan, maybe I could turn to you now to get your initial response to the paper, to your general feeling about the transatlantic commercial environment right now, particularly as we come out of the COVID crisis.
Absolutely. Thank you. Delighted to be here with everyone from the Atlantic Council and to see you again, Julia. So yes, thanks for the introduction. Just as a clarification for everyone who's listening, I'm here in Brussels. AmChemEU represents US business committed to and invested in Europe over here to just so we're clear on the objectives. Firstly, to build a strong and more united EU, but the second objective is very clear: to maintain and strengthen the transatlantic relationship, which has been referred to by Emily, certainly been a challenge over the last 4 years. I'd also just like to emphasize in terms of our priorities for this year, and which is fundamental to the background of what we're discussing, that we're absolutely committed to economic recovery, contributing to the economic recovery of Europe, but we're so intertwined, this means global economic recovery. And secondly is rebooting now, there's not just maintaining it, but rebooting the transatlantic relationship. And also just to stress, we're a non-partisan organization. So let me just, before I go into how we can do this, why is this so important? Actually, Representative Bayer has just alluded to some of this, but the transatlantic economy supports 16 million jobs across the Atlantic on either side. So our two continents are absolutely bound by deep investment flows. It's indeed not just trade, it's investment, it's joint projects, it's innovation. It's absolutely proven that we thrive together. I think we have to get out and continue to tell this story, which we've been doing for a long time now. When the EU does well, the US does too, and vice versa. It's been proven. We launched actually our own study just a couple of weeks ago, the Transatlantic Economy Study, which some of you may know all the facts and figures about how intertwined we are. But it confirms that the transatlantic economy is the engine of the global economy. So especially as we're all trying to recover from this pandemic, the effect, it can't be underestimated how important that engine is. I think, it's 1/3. EU and Europe and US is 1/3 of world GDP. Another metric that I think could be useful for us, and you may not know, is investment in research and development. It's very impressive. US companies in Europe spend $33 billion on R&D. That's US companies in Europe, while European companies in the US spend $45 billion. So look how we need each other, how we're investing in each other's economies. So the bilateral flows on R&D are actually the most intense in the world. And I really want to emphasize this because this is so important, and now how we start thinking about advancing the trade relationship further. And let's not forget the overall objective, which is to continue to provide prosperity and security for citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm sure the word inequality will come up at some point. We've got to ensure that this is spread evenly as well. It's not just some are going to benefit and some aren't. So this relationship is also, it's not just about the economy. it's also about the fact that we're allies. Let's not forget that. We are the staunchest allies. I think it's positive. Representative referred to this. I think there's a sense of optimism now. We're seeing this come out under the Biden administration. We have long-standing values and a common history. So we need to stand together now in the face of some of the geopolitical challenges that we're seeing together. And one of them has been mentioned, multilateralism. So let me just go on to briefly how, Julia. That's why it matters. How can we advance it? I think we've already alluded to that. Some of this came out in the brief. One, yes, we also agree. We support an ambitious agenda. We would support, yes, the more of the traditional trade agenda. Let's focus on emerging issues, geopolitical challenges, and reforming the WTO. We've actually spoken out very loudly. I'll emphasize that. 3 things. Reset the relationship. Let's bury the hatchet on the long-standing trade disputes we have, and let's move on. Let's bring back the adversarialism. We're seeing that. Refresh multilateralism. Let's reform the WTO, for example, move forward on that. Let's rekindle US leadership, especially in the face of geopolitical challenges such as China. With that, some emerging issues, maybe we can elaborate on those later. We should look at setting world standards, for example, on digital to sustainability. AI is one example. The EU's proposal to set up an EU-US Trade and Technology Council would also offer a very important platform for both sides to advance both the trade and investment relationship. Let's start to recognize each other's standards. So finally, I'd say if we want to be successful, we need to move forward in a spirit now of trust and transparency. That has been lacking over the last years. Also, we need champions for the transatlantic relationship in the business community too. We need to speak up more loudly, but also in the administrations, but also from legislators. And I think it's very positive today to have on this platform legislators from both sides of the Atlantic. It's absolutely crucial indeed that the European Parliament and the Congress work even more closely together. We've always tried to build this up, but we really look forward to building that up even further and having these 2 such important institutions work more closely together to achieve these aims. So with that, Julia, we really look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And with your direct allusion to the European Parliament, I'll turn to our third distinguished panelist, Monsieur Danjean, to perhaps shed a little bit light of the, what is the atmosphere right now around transatlantic trade in Brussels or Strasbourg, depending upon the week, and as a traditionally skeptical body, right, of transatlantic economic rapprochement in its previous forms. So interested in your thoughts.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon from Europe. Good afternoon, everyone. I share the sense of optimism expressed by my colleague from the Congress. In Europe, there is still a huge sense of relief first after the change of administration in the US. And if we have this timely discussion, it's precisely because of that. After 4 years of very bumpy relationship, and even worse than that, we have now the chance of I would not use the word rebooting or resetting as I just heard. It's to design something new. Of course, we don't start from scratch when it comes to transatlantic relationship, especially in the trade area. But I think a lot of things have changed, not only bilaterally between the US and the EU over the last 4 years, but in the world. And just the pandemic is, of course, the most obvious event, disrupting a lot of things. But the geopolitical scene has changed. Also, the economy, the world economy has changed. We have to learn a lot of lessons from that. And that's why I think there is an opportunity to redesign something new. Of course, taking stock of what we previously have achieved bilaterally, and it has been well recalled. The facts and figures are well known. And that's why I think something important was written in the paper you mentioned in your introduction, the first reaction of the EU Commission after the political change in the US, when they released this paper for a new EU-US agenda for global change. It was written, we should not embark on a nostalgic search for the global order of past decades. or the transatlantic partnership of past generations. The US and the EU have changed, as have power dynamics and geopolitical and technological realities. So that's why we should look for redesigning something new, which means taking into account all these changes, taking into account the priorities, also starting with realistic point of views. Everything will not be forgotten overnight. First, because a US administration, it's a long, how can I say, it's a long time to be settled. I mean, we are just in the phase of having people confirmed, and we do not have, when it comes to the executives, all the interlocutors in place. So we need time. And some patience is needed. That's why we should not be over ambitious or over euphoric in the short run. The second thing is there are still some irritants to be lifted. Of course, the extra tariffs related to the Airbus Boeing dispute were mentioned. I mean, the suspension of this for four months is a very good news and a very good sign, very positive. And it shows how we should work, but there are still irritants in place. Still an aluminium extra tariff, this is still not settled, this is still in place, and we do suffer from that in Europe, for example. So let's lift the irritant first. As we say in diplomacy, we should be building some confidence building measures because trust has to be restored. The lack of trust is still there. I mean, of course, we have a lot of expectation, a lot of optimism when it comes to the new administration, but still, when it comes to the concrete measures, a lot has to be done to show the goodwill and the will to engage. Another point I would like to raise is that I indeed do not believe that it will be a kind of a back to normal, given the fact that the normal has changed, but also given the fact that the normal prior to the Trump era was not an easy one. TTIP has failed. We did not manage to go through, and we have to take that into account. Why did it fail? And I don't think this TTIP model is up to the challenges we face now, a few years afterwards. So now the question is not so much on striking a deal, a trade deal like the classical one we used to have before. It's like designing a new agenda with a lot of things related to governance, to multilateralism, to norms and standards, certification. How can we have a digital and tech agenda together, EU and US, not to be bypassed or to have norms imposed by the Chinese, for example. This is a new agenda. This is not an unusual trade agenda, I would say, with free trade agreements being negotiated sector by sector. I think this is over. I don't think anybody is up to that now. What we want is a broader discussion, but also a discussion which is not, in which I would say trade is entailed in a more broader perspective. This is very ambitious, but this is needed. And this is needed because of China. This is needed because of the tech developments. This is needed because of the pressure of our citizens. When you have the events related to Facebook or Twitter, like we had in the previous months, there is a huge demand. And as elected people, we have to be sensitive to that. There is a huge demand for common approach of the EU and the US to rule and to set up standards. So these questions are, I would say, even probably more pressing than the trade issues as we use classically to envisage them.
Precisely, I think some colleagues of the Atlantic Council, we like to joke that sort of trade is not trade's name anymore. And we've moved far away from traditional balances in goods. And of course, that was one of the hangups, I think, of President Trump, was that he saw things in a little bit more in blanket plus or minus terms, not necessarily looking at the services sector. So, Representative if I can come back to you then, talking about these sort of next gen issues. I think that especially when we look at the digital economy and at climate, we could argue that the European Union is far ahead of the United States, right? We had an administration that did not prioritize climate issues, and on digital stuff, I'm coming from the executive branch myself, and I see it sort of divided up in different places within the administration and different responsibilities and aspects of the digital economy. So, I mean, how do you see us organizing ourselves better in the coming years?
All these easy questions. First of all, I want to pile on with Susan on the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. I mean, that's a great place to start. We've been working for quite some time. My colleague Susan Delbene, who represents Congress from Seattle, has been trying to drive forward our data trade agreements in the years to come. And I'm actually really optimistic. On the one hand, Catherine Ties, our new U.S. trade representative, a wonderful person with a deep trade background, had lived in Beijing for a number of years, speaks Mandarin, but is as American as you get, raised in Connecticut. And I think that her commitment to this will help immensely. And you also have a fundamental shift, I think, in how the U.S. views trade. The challenge we've had in the last 20 years is that the American left, and you don't have to go far left, just like center left, has become incredibly skeptical about trade. With the job losses, the auto manufacturers that have fled, and the rise of China. But with the Biden administration now, and with the success of the USMCA, NAFTA Part 2, there's a sense that we can have trade agreements that are good for climate and good for workers. And so the Biden has talked about a worker-centered trade agenda. Now, all of a sudden, that brings back, the center left and even the left in America as pro-trade. And the easiest place to do that is going to be with Europe, because you guys are so ahead on the environment and basically on worker rights. So this is, I think, the most optimistic time. But as we deal with COVID, which would be huge that we do together, and deal with climate together, the trickiest part is going to be figuring out data, which, Julia, is why your question started there. And I don't have any magic answers, but I know there's some really smart people on both sides that will be working on ways to deal with both the privacy, the huge political and economic power that the companies have. And then the other subtlety is the economic value of the personal data that is being shared and distributed around the world with essentially no compensation. And that is going to be, I think, one of the great frontiers, and also going to be one of the trickiest things for us to negotiate. And not just with each other, but with the companies themselves.
Thank you. And no trick questions, but we ask hard questions here at the Atlantic Council, so pardon me. If I could, maybe alluding to equitable growth, I'll turn to Susan and ask a little bit about the European perceptions, perhaps, of the Biden economic agenda, right? And I think that there have been some skeptical voices that are, anticipating a return to protectionism, whatever that means. Insert your interpretation here. But how do you see us being able to reconcile, a restoration of American growth, right? After I would argue years of underinvestment. And the ability to maintain an open free trade agenda.
Yeah, well, I can give you this sort of European perspective. I think from our side, I mean, just to go back to the Biden plan and what's been happening in not quite 100 days yet, but almost there. I think we're fully understanding on this side of the Atlantic that the focus has to be on domestic, which is indeed, to your point, sort of US growth. You need America to do well domestically in order for that to benefit, as I said before, whether it be the EU economy or the global economy. We need the US to thrive. So I think we support that. Saying that on the protectionism side, not that we would enter into that from our side of the Atlantic, but certainly as business, whether it's protectionism on the US side or on the European side, we don't consider that, beneficial for either way. It needs to, we need the markets to remain open. We need trade to be open and investment to be as free and easy as possible. So perhaps with that, but maybe I can sort of comment therefore just briefly a little bit, Julia, on what we have seen from the Biden administration, because we do see this optimism. It's been referred to, whether it's been the immediate reaction to COVID and how that's ramped up in order to get the economy going again, whether it's the rejoining Paris, absolutely supportive of that, because that is going to help again on the European side, rejoining, working together on green, on digital. Representative Bayer just alluded to that, and you mentioned, we're very supportive of, we don't know enough details yet of this Trade and Technology Council, but we certainly see that as an area, again, where we can work together. We just say we need to work together. I think the support for the WTO that has come out, that's a very positive sign. I think also I'm not sure everyone on the line's aware, there's been numerous engagements already that we see very positively as well. President Biden attending the council meeting just 2 weeks ago. We had Secretary Kerry over here. We had Secretary Blinken over here. Now progress being made on tax reform. I mean, it's too early for us to make comments on that. So I know that's addressing both the US growth and what's going to boosting the economy there, but that is going to have implications internationally as well. So we need to watch that carefully too. And I think the other area, which again is both for the US side, but also the European side, is data flows. So again, on the data front from the previous question, Privacy Shield, making progress on that, coming up with a solution is going to be beneficial for US growth, but also all of it. So again, I go back to the point that we need to cooperate. We're so intertwined. It's not about one or the other. We thrive together. So both our economies need to thrive on both sides.
I absolutely agree with that, and I'm personally a Keynesian as well. So I believe in the Biden domestic plan myself. Mr. Danjean, maybe we can, turning from alleged protectionism to protection, perhaps we can talk a little bit about what what Emily focused on in her paper about protective mechanisms in the economy, right? So what we can commonly refer to as economic statecraft, and coming from a background in the French government and now serving in the European Parliament, it'd be interesting to hear your views of the use of export controls and investment security, and how that might develop either in Europe autonomously or in cooperation with the US.
Well, first I would like to say that we are very optimistic indeed, and I share what has been said by other colleagues, but we still have a lot of domestic issues, I would say, European issues. We have inward-looking problems to be solved. We are still in the pandemic. It's less in the US now, thanks to the vaccination campaign. But I'm talking to you from a little place in France, which is still locked down. Everything is closed, no shops open almost, except for the food. So we have a lot of problems to solve in terms of recovery, in terms of domestic economy. And that's why the trade agenda should not be overestimated. I mean, of course, we are dedicated to that. We are committed to work on this, and that's our job. But we have to be fully aware that for the public opinion and for the ordinary citizens in Europe right now, what does matter is a recovery domestically. And that's also the case probably in the US, even if you are more advanced. I think the going out of this crisis is the absolute priority. So that's why I don't expect the trade agenda to go that quick, I would say, and we should not be disappointed by that. That's a matter of fact, and that's the way it is. We should take that into account and not be over-ambitious in too short time. When it comes to the new strategy in the EU for the trade, I mean, almost simultaneously with the paper on the US that we mentioned, EU-US relationship, there was a review of the trade policy. in the EU, and indeed emphasizing the need for the European countries to have a bit of a different look at the value chains, at the some dependencies, strategic dependencies, and also to be able to react and to answer to some very negative and hostile moves coming from elsewhere. And I have to say, and I have to admit that some of these hostile moves were done by the previous US administration, for example, on steel and aluminum. For example, some things were seen as very unfair. So we have to adapt to that, to the new world order or disorder. And that's why indeed there is an emphasis in Europe at the moment on some instruments helping us maybe to be more resilient. But having said that, we are always trying not to put at risk the openness. We well know that the single European market is probably the best asset for our economies. Being French, maybe I'm less convinced than some other people in Europe, because France is not so good on exporting, and we have a commercial balance which is not a positive one. So of course we are always more reluctant when it comes to the open trade and free trade, even ideologically, I would say. But putting that apart and not speaking as a French specifically, but as a member of a European family, well, in Europe we are well aware that the single market, an open single market, is still one of the best assets we have to recover and to grow. We also perfectly know what is at stake when it comes to the transatlantic trade and the economy, the intertwined economy. So we do take care not to hurt that and not to put any limitation to that. But it's true that we are more sensitive to some strategic dependencies. We are more sensitive to some unilateral measures we have been suffering from without any possibility to retaliate, and now we are considering that. It's also true that we are more careful in screening some investment, especially coming from Russia or China, but it could also apply to other countries. And the last point is about green and climate. The environmental issue has become a core issue in considering the trade policy. So sustainability, green, climate, this is really at the center of the preoccupation. And I must say, just to conclude, that we have some unfinished business right now in trade area. For example, in our negotiation with Mercosur, in our negotiation with Australia or New Zealand, what we see is most of the time these negotiations are becoming more and more difficult because of the green and the environmental and climate issues. This is something the public opinion here is very sensitive to.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And just a reminder to everyone, please submit your questions in the Q&A. I shouldn't be the only one asking questions here. This is an open forum, so please drop questions in the chat, and we'll come to them. Representative Bayer, to turn back to you maybe, and just to address the China question head on, right? I mean, how much will the transatlantic trade agenda play into Washington's stated desire to compete with China and to address unfair trade practices practiced by Beijing?
Well, Julia, I think absolutely essential. But let me just touch on one thing for 30 seconds first. Which is that we've been on the Joint Economic Committee, which is our bipartisan, bicameral think tank. For the last year, we've been talking to the best economists we could find in the US. And almost everyone says that we cannot return to the kind of growth we want until we get the virus under control. So the notion of the US and Europe working together, we're very acutely aware that the Pfizer vaccine came out of Germany, for example, which I had both of mine. You know, we've already committed $4 billion to purchase COVID vaccines for the most vulnerable, and another $2 billion immediately to COVAX. And that should just be a drop in the bucket. Right now, we're doing 4 million people a day in the US, and expect that worldwide we'll have 1 billion people vaccinated by the end of the year. but that still leaves 6.9 billion people unvaccinated throughout the world. And as we know, the growth of the variants, the ones that can be so very dangerous, happens in the unvaccinated population. So I think if there's any place where the US and Europe have to work together first, it's going to be on the vaccine efforts around the world, which leads us back to China, where theoretically the vaccine came from. They've had a different vaccine strategy, which seems to have worked pretty well. China and Russia are both competing, I put in parentheses, with us on vaccine diplomacy. I want us all to win. We want to play our role, but I don't want to denigrate their efforts. But most importantly, if you look at the long list of unfair trade practices in China, I think the forced labor with the Uyghurs being the one that concerns me most because it ties in with the human rights agenda. They are quickly going to be a much larger economy than the US. They have 5 times as many people. The only way I think we can reasonably compete with them and cooperate with them and draw them into what was our naive hope when we put them in the WTO all those years ago, was our common core together. And by the way, I think one of the places that starts is with the WTO. We've had Democratic and U.S. administrations very upset about the appellate body. We just co-sponsored a House resolution this week, recommitting ourselves to the WTO, but hoping to work together to resolve these persistent, nagging disputes that undermine the overall success of the WTO. It's still a very valuable institution.
Absolutely, and I think that there's a lot to be said there about the formation of the appellate body and Chinese behavior within the organization. Susan, maybe could I ask you also a China question and just ask about perceptions within the business community of increasing government concern over Chinese practices, particularly in supply chains.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, China, I think it's true to say, is sort of the big issue. It was, 3 to 4 years ago, it was the elephant in the room and no one would talk about China. But now it's out there. The commission has also come out and saying, they're a systemic competitor, but we need, so it's out there. I think from the business point of view, our position is very clear, is that we believe that we need to engage with and on China. It's clear that we have issues. Unfair trade practices, market access issues, quite a range there. It's clear also, indeed, that for a business, the Chinese market is considerably less open than the EU market. So we're called for fair competition and a level playing field. We've always been calling it's got to be fair on both sides. But we do feel that the best way to do this is to be at the table with them. We've actually welcomed the EU's decision, which is to try to engage with China in a reciprocal but in a conditional manner. We feel that's the best way to move forward. So what we're doing is trying to encourage reforms, market-based reforms, supporting where we can China's integration to the global economy. I'm sure those on the call are aware of the US has already got its agreement going with China under the Trump administration, but there has been the EU-China comprehensive agreement, which was signed, but it has not been ratified. It was signed. There was quite a lot of media around that at the end of the year, and the timing of that, which I've got no particular comment on that. I think it's taken 7 years to get there. Not really sure about its future. It's also up for debate now. Representative Bayer mentioned, the concerns about human rights and so forth. So it's a little bit contentious at the moment. However, it's the way forward. We need to work with China. Licensing restrictions are a big deal for US companies. It's a priority for us, licensing and certification. So we would really urge both both sides to work towards trying to lift restrictions in this particular area. But, overall, an open economy, an open global economy would be the best one, where we do have free trade with China and the rest of the world, but try and work with China towards that goal. Easier said than done, but that's our aim.
Well, thank you, Susan. And Mr. Danjean, I would be remiss if I did not ask a little bit about CAI and about its prospects within the European Parliament. I myself might be a little skeptical of the narrative building about Chinese counter sanctions and the direct impact on the deal, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, I'll be very, very frank with you. The CAI is not on the table right now in the European Parliament, because you know that at this very moment, 10 of my colleagues have been put on a sanction list, on a blacklist by China. So this hostile move towards members of the European Parliament has caused a widespread concern and also outrage. So we do not feel that we are in the position to discuss trade arrangement with China at the moment where the regime is putting our very colleagues on a blacklist. This is not the way to proceed. So I think the timing was bad. The way the CAI was signed is questionable, because it's like it was a last-minute political pressure to get to an agreement at any cost. So it doesn't give a good impression. We have to look at, and if we put, I would say, the political and diplomatical dimension aside, which is not easy, but let's try to focus on the purely economical and trade issue in the CAI. Around the CAI, we have to look very, very carefully on what it brings, because there is a lot of declaration of intentions, of good intentions, but we have to see how it could be indeed implemented, because we know that the real difficulty with the Chinese is to implement things. There is some goodwill sometimes, there is some openness sometimes, perspective of openness, but when it comes down to earth and when you come to the concrete measures, it's not there. So what we are looking at the moment is there something really beneficial from for the European companies? That's not that obvious. For certain dimensions, probably yes. But for all of them, it's not that obvious. And I'm doing this job with French companies, for example, trying to figure out which of them have something really to gain in having these kind of arrangements. It's not that obvious. So in any way, I think this CAI discussion will be very, very difficult in the European Parliament, even when if we overcome the diplomatic role at the moment with China. But the Chinese attitude at the moment doesn't help.
No, certainly not, and I believe you have full American sympathies in that regard. I'd like to bring in some questions from our audience now, we're going to get wonky right away, so feel free to answer as you see fit. And ask can the panel talk to the EU project of carbon border tax adjustment? So I know that this is maybe I'll turn right back to you, Mr. Danjean, because I know this is close to the French heart as well.
This is a project which has been discussed for a long, long time, because I remember running for the European Parliament election back in 2009. It was at the forefront of our proposals in France. But at that time, and Sarkozy was fighting for that as well. What has changed and what has made things happening now is the environmental issue. Because at the time, at first place, it was seen as a kind of a taxation, protectionist taxation or something like this. And it couldn't have gone through, within the EU, and it didn't work, actually. Now, things have changed, because these instruments, what is being discussed right now, and it's still preliminary, and we do not have the consolidated architecture of the whole mechanism. We voted something in the European Parliament last month, but it's only our opinion. I mean, we have technically to work together with the Commission and the member states now. It's quite complicated, it's very complex, but what is important is, first, it must be WTO compatible. So that's a very important aspect. And non-discriminatory and so on. And second, it's very much and almost exclusively climate centered, I would say. It's for environmental reasons, and it's not a protectionist approach. So these two, mixing these two parameters makes, I think, this mechanism acceptable. And also we can perfectly work with partners to see how we can implement that at a broader level. And I think it should be in the discussion with the US more specifically, because I think this is a tool we could have together in common regarding some other actors which are more problematic in that regard.
Maybe I can comment as well, Julia. Can I jump in on that one?
Of course you can.
Just really to say that, I agree with Monsieur Danjean. It's still quite early in the process, but maybe so the listeners have the sort of business perspective as well. Business is very involved and have submitted into this consultation process, but to the point there, as long as there's a level playing field, the idea is good. It's to level out the sort of, to ensure that it's fair if you're producing in a jurisdiction with lower standards, or it's got to be fair for those who are producing in Europe if the environmental restrictions and standards are higher. But there is a slight concern that it's also, what is this tax? We need to wait and see. It should not be, its primary goal should not be a revenue-making design. That's not what it's about. If it should be towards protecting the environment with environmental goals, and it should be WTO compatible, it's got to be well designed. And indeed, we've got to be careful that this doesn't start to be another trade irritant. So it's very important that the US is involved in this. We don't want this to evolve into something that we're then arguing about. So the principle is good, but let's make sure it is WTO compatible indeed. And also, actually, from the point of view of the EU, Monsieur Danjean, I'm sure you agree on that. The impact assessments is the word over here. Let's ensure that it's properly assessed first of all.
And to pile on, I would say that the carbon border adjustments are not well understood in the US at all. I'm very much in favor of them. And I think we need, thinking middle term, there's a growing consensus in the US of the need for significant carbon pricing. The US Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, ExxonMobil, even the American Petroleum Institute in recent weeks has come out for carbon pricing. So I'm hoping that in this Congress, the next year and a half, we will actually do that on an accelerating basis. It's of the many different tools we have to fight climate change, nothing is going to work better in terms of steering consumer behavior than making carbon much more expensive. And if we do that, then the border adjustments are absolutely going to be necessary.
Thank you. And I appreciate you're also saying that, there's an increasing support for this in the United States, but it's not very well understood. I think that many of us would agree with that assessment. Representative, I have a question from the audience regarding the EU's Digital Markets Act, right? And this is sort of seen perhaps as, going after big tech in the US. And I'll just steer that question a little bit and say, what do you think that the growing attitude towards technology companies will be in the coming years? There are a lot of different aspects floating around, from taxation to digital content and to antitrust.
Yeah, so complicated. And I confess that I have not been nearly as concerned as some of my colleagues about the efforts to tax big US digital companies in Europe for the work that they do in Europe that seems sort of sensible and fair. Our reaction has been, hey, they're US companies, we need to protect them, which is why I think we have to work together and have a common approach across the Atlantic on this. It's, I would say, complicated because on the one hand, 5 and 10 years ago, we were so excited about the way Facebook is changing the world. And now we've become so much more skeptical. Arnaud, I'm sorry that your pals were put on the Chinese blacklist. We just put a bunch of Russians on the blacklist in the last 2 days because of interfering in our elections through Facebook and Twitter and some of those other pieces. So when we see these big tech companies as people using them for nefarious purposes and how finding ways to clean that up, or just we all talk about the incredibly deep divide in America right now. Two sets of people working on different realities, different sets of facts. What's been driving the different facts is the big technology companies. Yes, we have to work really closely together, which will include dealing with the often unrestrained profits that are coming from that too. So.
Thank you. Susan, do you have any thoughts on DMA and maybe a little bit more on digital taxation as well, seeing that it's going to come to the fore in the next month?
Yeah, I don't have too much yet on the digital taxation. I think we're seeing it's going to be, it's good. It's going to be more complicated because we've now got the Biden plan for sort of US taxation as well. So we have to sort of analyze this more, look at it more how it's affecting us all. But we're sort of focused on from the EU side here. So very much on the taxation piece, we've been always calling out for agreement at international level. I mean, that's key. OECD is the way forward. So it's very positive now that the Biden's supporting that way forward. So on the DSA, well, it's the DSA and DMA, the two acronyms, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Indeed, I think just to say it's going to ramp up further. It's still sort of in relatively early stages. We have put input in, but this is where we do need to work together. I mean, the whole framework has to be modernized. Regulation has moved more slowly than the digital framework that we have and the digital industry, and we've just seen that in the last 12 months. So we're behind the times on this, but we do have to find this compromise between, or rather allowing innovation and allowing this to happen, because we need digital, whether it's for environmental reasons, whether for business reasons, economic reasons, but at the same time, absolutely ensure the safety of consumers and consumer welfare and citizens' welfare. And it's finding the balance between the two. So I think it's not going to go away quickly. Liability is one of the big issues we've been looking at. It's not going to be an easy one. Who is liable? Should there be exemptions? So a lot of issues there probably deserving of a bigger discussion. But in short, as business, we support regulation that seeks always to uphold free and fair competition, but make sure it's proportionate, and it's got to be proportionate, fact-based and justified, but also protecting consumers too.
Thank you. And we're coming up, we have 2 minutes left. Monsieur Danjean, I'll give you the final intervention. Also on digital, but I think going back to what the representative said about, the regulation of digital content and removing malign content from the internet. I know that this is something that has been subject to much conversation between the US and the EU, but also between France and the United States. And so where is that debate right now, especially, we're all thinking about January 6th still.
Well, I think I have seen the question of that was raised for the panel. I don't think indeed that we should consider this question of the digital market in Europe as only in terms of profit and money. It's a question of rule, regulations, it's a question of content. It's a question also on industry. I think you cannot blame Europe for trying to be less dependent even on the US when it comes to this kind of important and strategic dimension. And I think there is US is very dominant in Europe and US companies, and they will remain. It's a simple question of monopoly. And so we should not be totally depending on US companies. So there is no will to limit the trade with the US or to sever the link with the US in that regard. I think it's a question of a more fair and more balanced approach in terms of business, but also in terms of content and regulations. I think there is a common ground for working on regulation, even on taxation through OECD indeed, and I think also on bilateral basis with the new administration. Everybody understands that there is a need to do something. So what is really detrimental is any unilateral strong approach. I think we're not there yet, and even in Europe with this Digital Market Act, I think it's far from being a punishment for US companies, very far from that, and I don't think it will be the Chinese the upper hand in our market, in our economy. So we should clearly work together. I think there is a way ahead, quite natural one with this new administration. And as we said in the introduction, I'm quite optimistic. Let's not be over optimistic. Let's be realistic. But there is a common understanding that we have to go through multilateral work. What I heard on WTO is very encouraging. We have to work together to renew, to reshuffle this organization, and to have a level playing field globally, and that's a common aim. So a lot of things to be done, not to be over optimistic, not to be over impatient. Things will not move that quickly, and it should not. So it should not lead to disappointment if it does not happen overnight. But we have time, but we must deliver. What is important is delivery.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our very distinguished panel, Representative Bayer, Susan Danger from AmCham EU, and Arnaud Dangean from the European Parliament. I'd also like to thank Emily Bell for her wonderful paper. Please read it. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, thank you for watching and have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you.